Hello and welcome to this Total Education Media Centre lecture on Ireland. What we're going to do tonight is have a look at one story in particular, and that's The Road to Rankin's Point. And I'm going to analyse that story in detail. I'm going to show you how to analyse a story from Ireland so that any of the other stories that you need to study can be analysed by yourself. First of all, we're looking at Ireland in terms of the global, and I've talked about that previously. So let's just get straight into it. When we look at The Road to Rankin's Point, it's a very typical story, shall I say, of Alistair MacLeod from this book Ireland. And to place it in context, it's one of the stories that focuses very clearly on the link between the outer world and the inner world, and in many ways the past and the present, and in this case not much future. The style is very descriptive, very languid in many ways, talks briefly about personalities and times, but it builds around two main characters, Callum and the grandmother. And the plot's very simple. Callum's dying, he comes home, they want to move the grandmother out of a home, the family home that she's been in for centuries. And what we're looking at here is not a passing of the baton, but an ending of the baton in many ways and respects. And that the world has come to them, and the world hasn't changed in this little part in Rankin's sort of farm, but yet the world has changed around them, and it's coming to them all the time and putting pressuring. And certainly the family comes and puts pressure on the grandmother to go into the nursing home, which she absolutely reviles. In the end, she's saved by Callum, because she says that Callum will stay with her and he'll take over the farm, and she has left everything to him, but unfortunately he's dying and he tells her that, and she then dies that night herself. And there's some lovely links in the story that I'll go into in a moment. The links to the global, of course, are about the simple things in life, and we're looking here at, say, fish prices, for example, at the start of the story, or on page 144, and I'll read this quote to you because it's very clear. This quote talks about the specific link to the outer world and how the world has come to them. Remembering we're on an island here, Cape Breton, and it's been a very isolated place, a very lonely place where people have been extremely self-sufficient, and now that's all changed. And I think MacLeod puts this very clearly when he writes, and this is on page 144, and obviously near the start of The Road to Rankin's Point. At the outskirts of the village, the narrow paved road turns to the left, away from the sea, and begins its journey inland and outward. If followed relentlessly, it will take you almost anywhere in North America, perhaps to Central and to South America as well. It will remain narrow and unpretentious and slow in the caution that it demands of its drivers for approximately 50 miles. Then it will join the maple-leafed Trans-Canada Highway, and together they will boom across the Canso Causeway and off Cape Breton Island and out into the world. As the water of the tributary joins the major river, its traffic and its travellers will blend and mingle within the rushing stream. And I think that's a very obvious and literal link to the outer world, and it's brought the world to them and it takes them away, and it gives that diverse range of opportunities. None of this, however, has affected the grandmother. I'll talk about Callum first, though, because we meet him first as he goes to his grandmother's. Callum's terminal. He's going to die. We see him quite sick at the end, and he refers to himself as a dying salmon, one of the salmon that go up the tributaries to breed and then die. He's going home to die, in other words. And there's a connection to the past when he hears the dogs howl, and there's lots of things like that. And we see we've sort of linked the place to the world, and now we can link individuals to the world. And we see him, as he says on page 145, the very next page, Callum talks very clearly about, but for me, in this my 26th year, it is not into the larger world that I go today, and the road that I follow feeds into no other that will take the traveller to the great adventures of the wilds unknown. And he goes on to talk about how instead it takes him directly to a very isolated part of Cape Breton. In fact, the end of the road to Rankin's Point and that's where the farm is. And as he goes past, he sees the road's lacking repair, and there's not many people living there anymore, and it's not the kind of world or the kind of place that he's used to. Remember that Callum's come home and he's been away and he's gone out into the world and he's mingled in the global, and he's become part of that global world. And it's interesting that he returns home. The change of place and sense of place is very important in McLeod, and it's the grandmother's farm is a very particular place and a very insular place within the wider world. And McLeod comments on that continuously. We see it in the very particular animals that she has, the dogs that she's bred, the cattle that she's bred, the chickens that she's bred. And the family is tied to the place. It's tied not just through history, but as a group and as a sort of living entity on that part of the world. They're tied to it. And we learn this in a series of anecdotes. The place is extremely personal and significant. For example, the little turn of sadness where the grandfather has died and left her alone with 7 children. He dies, a rum bottle breaks in his pocket when he falls, and he bleeds to death there, and she has to save him. And yet, while all these things are very personal and very intimate, McLeod doesn't hesitate to go out into the world to tell anecdote as well. And we learn about the reflection on the trip to Jamaica where they have their photos taken with the girls, and it's a sort of fake thing, and that is in direct reference to, of course, the fake family photo where everyone appears to be happy that's taken later on. We know it's a wild and remote place, and McLeod doesn't touch on family necessarily here. What he does is he touches on another incident, a lover's quarrel perhaps, where a car is pushed off the edge and destroyed and no one can rescue it, no one can get it. The place is too wild. They try every kind of rope, every kind of tow truck, and they just can't do it. And so it remains there, desolate, rotting, falling apart, much like an analogy to the farm and the grandmother in many ways. The world's changing, and we see that in the text. And you'll never get this sort of thing on your first reading. I particularly think you should read, and I tend to read these stories 3 times. The first time you read for plot, the second time you read, and you're looking for little things there, and the third time you read it and you really have your eye open, because your brain's not looking for the plot or the character. What it's looking for is the specific thematic purposes you're looking for in the language and the little things that you put into an essay that really count. So that's one little tip I'd give you. You won't get much of the analysis done by reading it only once and hoping for the best. I mean, you'll get the obvious quotes, such as the one I read right at the very start, but there are other little things in there that you need to relate to that will sort of push you up into a better A range for an exam essay. Let's look at, I've talked about the use of anecdote, for example, and how McLeod points out the world's changing. He points to the grandmother's farm as decaying. It's not your typical farm where you go home and it's a white picket fence and there's happiness and all cheer. There's none of that when he returns home. The world's bypassed the farm. It's sort of, well, not even bypassed it, it's just never got there in many ways. And the farm seems to be a basic anachronism in the world, and all around it's dying. He points this out very clearly. And if we look at page 151, there's a nice little quote here as he goes, and he talks about the other farmhouses that have all gone. Now and then upon the left I see the remains of the old stone fences, and also tiny patches of still cleared land indicating where houses once stood. The grey granite stones of their foundations are still visible, covered now with green and velvet moss. Now and then a stone flue stands with phallic realty amidst the rubble of the house that has fallen down around it. Only the strength of stone has survived the ravages of time and seasons. And that's a really beautifully written paragraph, and so very typical of McLeod, of course, and how he writes. Importantly, it gives us a sense of a tone and a sense of mood and a sense of place by dragging together all those images. And it's a lovely piece of writing. It also hints at nature, and of course these stories are about nature very much because the people are at one in many ways with the island, and it's the world that intrudes that breaks that cycle of nature And it does so at the grandmother's farm too, through her old age and her unwillingness to leave in many ways. Nature and natural cycles are very important in these stories, and you need to look for that link between how the world moves in and how the global changes those sorts of things. And he talks about that in this story in many ways, about how other people have got different farm animals, and the dogs are particularly bred for sheep herding, and new dogs on the island don't do that. They're not useful dogs, and those sorts of things. And in that instance, the natural cycle, he's saying, is going to come back and claim everything, and the farm will end up in ruin and when the grandmother goes. And I think that's lovely. The grandmother herself is a magical character. She's a brilliant character and extremely well composed and created. And it's if MacLeod knew someone very much like that very strong independent. She rejects the world. She rejects the global. She rejects change completely and totally, and is quite happy in doing so. She's always been very self-sufficient, very independent. There's no sense of modernity in her at all. And what she's done is she's taken, the close glimpses of the world that she's given, like the nursing home. She hates and rejects that. She fears it in many ways because it's not her life. It's not her home. She has a very limited vision of the world. The road out means nothing to her. The road out, her whole vision, and there's a quote in here, a lovely little quote in the story where it said, she sees as far as Prince Edward Island. And that's just the next island. That's all she's ever thought about. And for her, that's nearly the end of the world. And that shows her limited vision of the world. She doesn't see the world as a global place. She sees the world as basically her farm, perhaps the town and the island at best, and nothing else. She's very self-sufficient, as I said, and in a commoditised world, and we talk about the mercenary nature of the modern world, she's rejected all that, and she's very self-sufficient on the farm, even though things are falling apart. And that idea about what are we going to do with Grandma, what about Grandma, the question that's asked every year, is a very modern one. It intrudes on her way of life, and while people think they're doing the best for her, perhaps they're not in many ways, and they don't realise this, and it sort of becomes a rejected thing. Her individual strength is shown really clearly on page 172, and we can go through the stories of what she's done and how she's done it, and how she gets the body of her husband back with 7 small children, survives and wants to live. And I think it's very important that we just have a quick look at that quote. And it's on page 172. And what it says is, she says very clearly, I would not be that dead. It does not matter that some things are difficult. No one has ever said that life is to be easy, only that it is to be lived. I have come today, partially at least, hoping to find such strength for the living of my life and the meeting of my death. So in other words, her power and strength and ability to survive through anything and not take life easily, but work at it and live it, Callum looks for that. He wants to respond to that, and I think that's important. And you need to read carefully to get those little ideas. She dies alone, but really that's the ending that we all have in many ways, and it's the ending we have to have. And the description shows us, and the dogs are the link and the cycle. And it's really, it shows her death brings the end of an era. Her life is another time, and you need to look at the quote on page 178 to clearly understand that. My takeaway tip for this text would be that you really need to read it very carefully and look at the techniques that MacLeod uses, and I've mentioned them in here. Not all of them, but some of them, and they transfer to many of the stories. So when you're analysing and looking at these particular stories, look at how he builds that sense of individuality and place against that global, and how the global impacts on those sorts of things, and how the world comes to the grandmother, in particular in this story, and to Callum. Don't forget, press like down below so we can keep these videos going. Don't forget to go to our website, it's very important. And have a look at the other literature we have there for sale for you to help you get through your HSC and any exams that you have. We have a full range of all sorts of literature to download from that website. We also have past exams if you need questions to help you with. That's all for this evening. Thank you.